Welcome to the Brown University Library. My name is Joe Meisel. I am the University Librarian. Please come in. There's plenty of seats still. So it's great to see you all, even on this cold day, but a really momentous moment. And in welcoming you in person and virtually to this space, I want to acknowledge that Brown University is located in Providence, Rhode Island, on lands that were within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded these lands with great care, continues as a sovereign nation today, and we commit to working together to honor our past and build our future with truth. So building our future with truth could not be more appropriate for the mission of libraries generally, and this event in particular. We're here to mark the near completion, good, of digitizing the Hall Hoag collection of dissenting and extremist propaganda, as it was labeled at the beginning. And I just want to acknowledge my understanding is I haven't had the pleasure yet of meeting family members of Grace Hoag who are in the audience. And I'm not certain whether any relatives of Gordon Hall are here or are online, but if you are, also very special welcome to you all. We are the great beneficiaries here at Brown, and now the world is going to be an even greater beneficiary. So we're here because of this digitization and because of this extraordinary collection. And we have this occasion with a great set of scholar collaborators to consider the public importance, the scholarly importance of this uniquely large and uniquely extensive archive of ideological ferment in post-war United States. And one particular aspect of distinction of this collection, as well as some other materials at the John Hay Library here, is the representation of materials from the political right. Now, why is that extraordinary? It just is the case that right-wing groups and organizations tend to be less inclined to have their papers wind up at places like Brown University. It's been a different kind of ecosystem. So this is a real great strength for us and a great point of distinction. So in a few minutes, I'd like to turn things over to our terrific panel of experts to talk about the collection and what the widespread availability of these materials, which is more than 1 million digitized pages, might mean for academic research and broader public understanding of the past, the present, and possible futures. Before proceeding, I would like to also note that this event is part of the Brown 2026 initiative, which is leading up to the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and exploring it in ways that only institutions like research universities, research libraries, and other knowledge institutions can do. There's a brief video to describe this further, and if we can roll the video.
We are proud to observe the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States through Brown 2026. The goal of Brown 2026 is to examine the important role of research and teaching universities in fostering open and democratic societies. This faculty-led initiative draws on Brown's strengths as a rigorous, multidisciplinary research university and as a community of learners that seeks to confront important questions that have faced democracies in the past and that will continue to face them in the future.
Brown 2026 builds on Brown's long-standing commitment to engage in rigorous discussions of complex and contested historical issues, even uncomfortable ones. Brown's landmark 2006 report on slavery and justice modeled how a university could examine, in a clear-eyed and scholarly way, its own historical ties to racial slavery.
That reputation that Brown has for doing that kind of hard history really informs the way that we're working through Brown 2026. Truthfully, there's never been a moment in American history when things felt settled for the nation. So drawing these connections from 1776 to 2026 is a really valuable contribution that we can make.
A hallmark of Brown's approach to teaching and research is interdisciplinary collaboration. It's this unique approach to collaboration that research universities bring to the table. Brown 2026 engages the full university community, reaching across the arts and humanities, as well as the social, physical, and life sciences, to confront the questions facing pluralistic and open democracies today.
Democracy in America has always been a contact sport. American democracy has endured and thrived from one generation to the next on the basis not of harmony, but of conflict. Political conflict is not a disease in a democracy. It can be a profound source of strength, force for change and for good, but only so long as we find enough in common to see ourselves as one nation.
The Brown 2026 initiative invites us to confront and consider together these and other pressing questions. We look forward to exploring them with you and with all of Brown's extended community.
Okay, that is a wonderful summation, and I want to recognize many members of the steering committee of Brown 2026 in the audience here, but particularly, as you saw on the video, Karen Wolf, director of the John Carter Brown Library and professor of history, and Kevin McLaughlin, director of the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study and professor of English, and much else, I believe. Let me move on and get into the meat of things. Before we hear from the scholars exploring the impact and the meaning of this collection and what its potentials may be, I thought it would be really interesting and important for the audience today to also hear from representatives of the archival team that have been carrying out this massive digitization effort that has been looking at these materials anew through that lens and from the archival organization perspective. And this is a very important dimension too of how scholarship now and in the future is going to be enabled. So I would like to introduce two colleagues, Andrew Majcher, who is the head of digital services and records management here at the John Hay Library, and Ariel Flowers, who is the Divided America project archivist. So please.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Majcher. I am the head of digital services and records management at the Brown University Library and supervisor for the Divided America project. I would like to echo Joe's thanks to everyone for attending today, and thank you to our scholars for being here as well. I have the pleasure of introducing you to the Divided America project. The project, over the last 2.5 years, has digitized the majority of the Gordon Hall and Grace Hoag collection of dissenting and extremist propaganda, printed propaganda. The project has been made possible thanks to generous funding from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission and the Arcadia Fund. The digitized materials are actively being uploaded into the Brown Digital Repository, and it will result in over 1 million items from the collection being digitally available to researchers across the US and the world. And if you go there right now, I think 250,000 of the items are currently available. So we're actively uploading them as we talk. I would like to also thank the members of the project's cross-functional team. Without them, we would not be able to get the materials into the digital repository, our digitization vendor, Digital Arc, and the John Hay Library staff and student workers from past and present, because without them, we would not be able to do the work that we're doing. The Hall Hoag collection focuses on printed organizational literature often ephemeral, that was for circulation among members or to promote or convert others to their causes. The collection consists largely of pamphlets, leaflets, and correspondence created by individuals and organizations representing a spectrum of social and political viewpoints, ranging from the far right to the far left from the 20th century. As one of the library's premier collections, the Hall Hoag collection forms the anchor for our strategic collecting initiative, Ideology and Power, which seeks to provide coherence and promote public access to original material that documents the evolution of political, social, and religious ideologies in the United States. These materials represent foundational views to the social and political movements that are with us today, including the current conservative movement that has swept the United States the last few decades. The namesakes of the collection, Gordon Hall and Grace Hoag, were champions of exposing and shining a light on extremism in their work. Gordon Hall, from his experiences in World War II, saw extremism as dangerous. Hall came to the determination that groups from both the far right and the left of American society were a danger to democracy and good government, and he set out to combat them. Hall began to research, infiltrate, and investigate these groups and actively collected their printed propaganda. He supported this research by giving public lectures about the dangers posed by radical extremists and hate groups, in which he used their own propaganda as evidence of their ideology and activities against them. By the 1930s, Hall was known by the organizations he was collecting on and exposing. He turned to a circle of like-minded volunteers for his collection efforts. Grace Hoag joined Hall during this time. After attending one of his lectures, she started by attending meetings and rallies of various groups and brought the literature back to Hall. Then Hoag started to assist Hall in sorting and organizing the materials organized by the volunteers, or retrieved by the volunteers, excuse me. In the 1960s, Hall and Hoag broadened their collecting to include dissenting organizations. Grace Hoag said, "The change in the collection strategy became necessary as we came to understand how tricky it was to determine where a group was heading politically and where their ultimate destination might lie. A seemingly innocuous organization could turn disturbingly violent, threatening to firebomb or assassinate public figures. A group might vent frustrations through physical showdowns with local police or attack private property. As a consequence, we expanded our focus to encompass more than just the far right and the far left." While Hall lectured, Hoag pored over the materials. We did duplicates and categorized them and the materials by subjects. In this process, she created the database that became the nucleus for the collection's existing online finding aid for the part 1 of the collection. The methods that Hall and Hoag used were unique for aggregating material from organizations from faint, if any, traces in the archival record. Gordon Hall and Grace Hoag's legacy lives on here at the John Hay Library through the collection and the project. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Ariel Flowers, to talk about the students and how they worked on the project.
And let's tilt this down. There we go. The worries of being short. Well, I would like to thank everyone for coming today and for coming to kind of celebrate Hall Hoag. This has been a university-wide endeavor. So I'm up here to speak very briefly about the people who I would consider to be the backbone of this project, and that has been our student workers. Over the past 3 years, as part of processing the enormous collection that is Hall Hoag, we have employed around 35 student workers over the past 3 years, some of whom are with us today in person and some of whom are joining us on Zoom. Some were with us for maybe only a few weeks or months, and some of them have been with us essentially throughout the entire project. They have been critical to processing the over 1 million images that are going to be available on the BDR, to sorting through thousands of boxes of archival material, many of them getting to work with archival material for the very first time. So I would like us to take a moment to thank them for all of their excellent hard work, because they truly were essential to getting this material up and going, to processing it, to filing, to cataloging, to weeding out anomalies, to hunting things down. They have been essential to this project, and it's been wonderful to give this kind of opportunity to Brown undergraduate students. I would also like to thank the other colleagues who are not necessarily part of this project, who essentially really came in to help us in the beginning, other members of staff, including our team in like the mailroom in the Rockefeller Library for moving things back and forth, for making sure things got where they needed to go. I would also like to thank Digital Arc, who is the one processing all of these images, taking them and sending them off to us. This has been a multi-person, multi-faceted project over the past 3 years, and I'm really excited that we can now showcase it for the world and people can see how hard we have worked on all of this.
Great. So the work of providing frictionless access to the material involved a lot of friction and effort. And thank you both, Andrew and Ariel. It really has been a Herculean undertaking, but also a great opportunity, as Ariel said, to give hands-on research experiences to our students in this area of work. And that's something we've really been very focused on in the library. I also want to note that some of the materials from the collection are downstairs on the first floor in the exhibition gallery. These ones focusing in particular on groups that are related to religious extremism. And after the proceedings today, Andrew and Ariel and other colleagues will also have some additional materials on display next door in 321 for those who are able to spend a little extra time, and you'll be available to talk about the materials and so forth. So really exciting. Now let's get to the main event. I want to turn things over to Professor Seth Cotlar, Professor of History at Willamette University. And I will just say he has been an outstanding partner in organizing this event, and he'll also be serving as moderator with his colleagues. I won't go into depth about Seth's accomplishments. I will mention he is class of 1990 here at Brown. That's one accomplishment. But Seth is a really very noted scholar on many aspects of the restlessness and contestation that we were hearing about, that really has been foundational to our political experiment since the founding. And also, Seth has been a frequent flyer with the Hall Hoag collection. So without further ado, Seth, I'm going to turn things over to you. And with great anticipation, join the audience.
Be sure that we leave time at the end for questions. So at least 15 minutes, maybe hopefully more. Sorry, I will use the microphone. So I'm going to just briefly introduce my fellow panelists here, and then we have a series of 3 questions that we're going to talk about kind of extemporaneously with each other, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So Marsha Barrett, who is first here on my left, is an assistant professor of history at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research examines the social and political history of the US during the 20th century, and her recently published book, which is fantastic, Nelson Rockefeller's Dilemma, the fight to save moderate republicanism, right? Very different, examines Rockefeller's career as a means for understanding the fate of moderate republicanism and the broader transformation of the political landscape after the passage of the 1960s federal civil rights legislation. And part of the reason, I won't steal your thunder, Marsha, but part of the reason why Marsha is here with us is that as she was researching Nelson Rockefeller, she kept encountering all these far-right groups in his archive, and oh, what do I make of this, right? In fact, all of us, I think, have a similar kind of story of encountering this stuff and then trying to make sense of it. To Marsha's left is Jennifer Mittelstadt, who's a professor of history at Rutgers University, and she studies the 20th century US with broad interests in the state and social policy, politics, women and gender, social movements, the military, and foreign affairs. She's the author and editor of 4 books, including 2 monographs, single-authored monographs, From Welfare to Workfare, The Unintended Consequences of Liberal Reform, 1945 to 1964, and The Rise of the Military Welfare State. And she's currently working on a project that I won't tell you about. She will tell you about anti-United Nations sentiment, and especially grassroots women activists and their role in sort of opposing internationalism in the Cold War era. Okay, I just said it. And next to Jennifer is John Huntington. And John is a history professor at Houston Community College. He got his PhD at the University of Houston in 2016. John is the author of a book called Far Right Vanguard, which is part of a kind of new wave of scholarship, rethinking the relationship between what we think of as the far right and the mainstream conservative movement. And so the argument of his book is in essence that what we have historically thought of as the far right was actually kind of the vanguard of where conservatism was going. Right? And so it's a really sort of important contribution to the field. All right, so let me start with our first question. And Marsha, since you're first to my left, do you mind taking it first? Okay. And so the question is, how did you come to study the history of the far right, or as Gordon Hall put it, extremists?
Well, I have a couple of ways I'll answer this question. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the career of Nelson Rockefeller, but very famously, in 1964, the Republican National Convention in San Francisco, Nelson Rockefeller called out extremists that he said were subverting the Republican Party. A year before that, he actually made a speech very similar to that, where he made this case that extremists were infiltrating the Republican Party and convincing and sort of luring sort of regular establishment Republicans over to with this idea that they could build up the party in the South by embracing racism and segregationists. And he made this case, but he was very careful, though, to say that Republicans weren't extremists. There were outsiders who were trying to take over the Republican Party and subvert it. He was very, very careful about that. And despite all of this care, his moderate peers, other establishment Republicans, said that he just wanted to win the nomination. This is not real. This isn't a real problem. Nelson just wants to be elected. He wants to be nominated. Don't worry. Yeah, there might be some issues, but no one needs to be too concerned. And what I was, and hey, politics like that, you can't just disregard it altogether. But the other way that I could answer this question, though, about extremism is that when I would look at what in his archive are called political files, right, the letters that people from across the nation would send him, I would find some of the worst rhetoric. Nelson Rockefeller, you are an N-word lover, saying terrible things about African Americans, but also what just seemed to me like outlandish material, right, about opposing the United Nations. Nelson Rockefeller is a socialist who is trying to, undermine the sovereignty of the United States. And honestly, I looked at a lot of this material, which were often, pamphlets and leaflets that would be mailed to Nelson Rockefeller. And I just thought, this can't be real. Like, what is this? And partially though, it was because I wasn't sure what to make of it, because Rockefeller and his staff didn't talk about it. They were very concerned about, this fear that extremists were, going to inject racism into the Republican Party, but there was no talk about, this other sort of conspiratorial, like these groups in the language. So I'm really grateful for this collection. We have another question I'll answer later, because if I had seeing, right, the breadth of organizations, like how the organizations and the materials are organized in this collection, I would have had a framework to understand like where these materials were coming from. And I very well would have written my book differently if I had known how organized and important these groups were. And I would just look at the material and think, I don't know what this is, what is this? And I just sort of set it aside, and sort of focused on the ways that Rockefeller talked about extremism and how he emphasized it. And ultimately, I think, right, he downplayed the significance in the same way that so many other Republicans did, even though he was one of the prime Republicans who spoke out. So.
Thanks, Marsha, and thanks, Seth and John also for being here, and Joe and Brown for inviting us to do this. It's exciting to be able to reflect on the history of the right with the people who preserved the history, and to think more deeply about what it meant to be, Grace Hoag, doing this in the moment. I think often we take it for granted, but actually we've talked that we haven't really taken this for granted. Like all along we've been thinking about how we interact sort of with Hall and Hoag, even though they're not with us, in reacting to the same things that they were looking at. So it's very exciting to be here with everyone today. I came to study the far right in a much different way. I have very eclectic and broad historical interests, but my interest came out of my own family history. My grandparents were conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical Christians. And I had any number of interesting experiences with them growing up, but one that sort of stood out to me was that members of their church in St. Louis in 1985 worked with conservative leader Phyllis Schlafly and the Eagle Forum, which was headquartered there, in order to create shoeboxes for freedom for the Contras, who were the collection of militia groups and armed groups who united around opposing the elected Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And I guess it was one of those things that at the time, my own parents said, because we were not politically conservative or evangelical Christians, we'd sat around the dinner table and said, what are they doing now? And then I just sort of put it away, went on, became a historian, and later, said, what were they doing? And so I started searching, and I started actually, it wasn't that easy, because finding stuff on grassroots everyday people, like maybe the people at my grandparents' church, is a little bit of a needle in the haystack. And most of what's written about the right and foreign policy in particular is very top-down, understandably focused on elected officials and people who held power in administrations and really characterizing their approaches. So trying to sort of not follow my grandparents' story like up, but to follow it like out and down, proved both difficult and exciting. And this is where a collection really like Hall Hoag comes in and opens up, I think, a world of possibility. And the world of possibility that it opened up for me was to find out that my grandparents' church basement assembly of shoeboxes for freedom was really only the latest in what is in fact like a really long and often vigorous engagement of everyday grassroots right-wing people in issues related to foreign policy. And that foreign policy itself might be something that is of great concern to everyday right-wing people in the United States. Most of the literature on the right has been written about domestic US politics and the interests of everyday people in those politics. So to find that they were actually interested in foreign policy, that they had been interested in foreign policy for a really long time was exciting. And then came the process using the collection of finding what were these organizations. Some of them you might be familiar with, like the John Birch Society, but many of them are very little known, sort of lost to history, except in some of the pamphlets and things that had been collected and They're obscure. Federation for Constitutional Government, Congress of Freedom, just to name a couple of them. And then there were groups that I always knew the name of, but I had no idea how involved they were in a grassroots right-wing politics aimed at foreign policy, like the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Patriotism Committee of the National American Legion, for example. So, you know, this question that I had about what was going on with my grandparents' church and what they were doing ended up leading me all the way back, even further than the post-Cold War period in the UN, all the way back to 1919 and the League of Nations. And now I'm, you know, still digging myself out and getting on top of everything that I've found.
Hey, so like Jennifer, mine is a family story in a way. I grew up in a small town in Texas. I grew up in Georgetown, if any of y'all know where it's like north of Austin. And when I grew up there, it was a pretty small town. I grew up in a very conservative family, evangelical Christians, and you know, with conservative politics, rock-red Republicans, that sort of thing. And so when I growing up, I can remember riding in the back of the family minivan, right, with Rush Limbaugh playing on the speakers. And so when I went to college, you know, I thought I had a pretty good idea of what conservatism was and what people talked about and these sorts of things. And then when I got to grad school, I started reading books on conservatism, and the things that I was reading didn't always reflect the things that I heard growing up, whether that was, you know, things about race, things about business, you know, these sorts of things about religion, the role of religion in public life. And so I was kind of curious then, well, these things I heard growing up, the stuff that I heard on Rush Limbaugh, like, how does that stuff factor in? Like, where does that stuff fit? Because politicians tend to be more circumspect when they're talking to the public about their true beliefs sometimes. And so I wanted to figure out, okay, well, how deep does this rabbit hole go, right? Who talks like Rush Limbaugh back in the day? Because I didn't see that sort of stuff always reflected in the readings, and so I started doing some digging on far-right groups and started seeing things that I recognized a lot more in these far-right groups, you know, with the things that I kind of grew up around. And that's not to say that, you know, my parents are like Klansmen or anything, to be clear, right? But I started seeing a lot more of the things I grew up around reflected in these readings and writings, and they made more sense to me. And so that's kind of how I started studying it, you know, going to these small archives, a lot of personal archives, private archives, studying these very small groups and looking at their private correspondence and thinking like, this is the kind of stuff, you know, that I was raised around sometimes. And so that's kind of how I came to study this.
All right, well, I'll tell my story sort of briefly. For me, it's about teaching, actually. So I teach at Willamette University, which is across the street from the state capitol in Oregon. I was trained as an early American historian. My first book was about the 1790s. And when the Tea Party started, I could actually hear the protests or the rallies happening out my window. And one day I decided to go out and just like take a look, walk around, talk to people. And one of the fellows I met there was a descendant of Fisher Ames, who was a reactionary from the 1790s who I had just finished writing about in my book. And I was like, well, my goodness, let's talk about Fisher Ames. And this Tea Party, he had the tricornered hat on and the whole deal. He was a local kind of small-time industrialist who funded a lot of right-wing politics in Oregon. And his take on Fisher Ames was a little bit different than mine. In fact, there were many things that he thought Fisher Ames said that I happen to know he did not say. And so anyway, I was taken by the kind of appropriation of early American history by folks on the far right. And my first project, it was not, I shouldn't call it a project, it was a lark, but it was called Fake Founders Quotes, because I sort of became obsessed with all of the things that people on the right ascribed to the founders, which they actually didn't say. And that struck me as fascinating because they claimed to be such originalists, and yet they had a real penchant for just inventing things that the founders had said. Okay, so anyway, so this is where it kind of started. And as I taught that course, and so I decided to teach a course on the history of American conservatism, because my students, who are mostly liberal, I felt like it would be useful for them to understand the people with whom they disagreed politically, right? And so at the time I started teaching it, the literature on, much like John's experience, the literature on the history of conservatism tended to really emphasize the distinction between like the reasonable conservatives and the fringe, right? And as I began reading more of the literature and teaching the course over time, that stark distinction started to fall apart, right? It seemed more like a continuum or a coalition rather than a stark divide. And so I got interested in this for my own purposes, and so I started to teach a course on the far right after my conservatism class. And so I went looking for a person who would be an organ hook for my students. And I went into the Hall Hoag collection, and I did a search for Portland and Oregon, and I found a guy named Walter Huss. And never heard of him before, asked a bunch of my friends, anyone ever heard of this guy? No one ever heard of the guy. And I started doing more research, and I discovered he became the chair of the Oregon Republican Party in 1978. And then I discovered that 57 boxes of his papers were at the University of Oregon. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. No one's ever heard of this guy. And then when I started looking at his papers, I discovered that he was a neo-Nazi. There you go, who had been a silver shirt in the 1930s and wrote fan letters to David Duke in the 1990s. So this is how I got, totally unintentionally, because I happened to be in Oregon, because I happened to be teaching these courses, and I happened to stumble upon this guy that no one had ever heard of before, but who seemed really historically significant. I stumbled my way into this field, and so here I am. All right, so our next question is, so what do you see as the significance of a collection like this, like for your own work, for the history of the right, just for today in general? Do you want to start us off here?
Sure. I think having all of these different groups and their papers together, right, allows us to sort of understand how this community really works and sort of builds upon one another and sort of connects in ways that you might not know otherwise, right, because these are such small organizations. And I think it can also help us to understand that connection to the Republican Party and establishment figures in the Republican Party, you know, in a way that we wouldn't really be able to see that, I think, otherwise. You know, it's like, again, I think about my own research with on Nelson Rockefeller, so, you know, doing that work, I found an interview that a biographer of Rockefeller conducted in the 1980s with F. Clifton White, who was the campaign manager for Barry Goldwater. And the biographer, Carrie Reich, asked him, you know, about 1964 and about extremists and their support for Barry Goldwater. And, you know, White just laughed, and he was like, you know, there were a lot of nuts. That was a term he used. A lot of nuts in Orange County, and they just loved Barry Goldwater. And you know, I wasn't going to, you know, I did my best to sort of hide any like connections between their, you know, Barry Goldwater and the John Birch Society, but it was very much there. And you know, I wasn't gonna, you know, tell people publicly, but I did want them to vote for Barry Goldwater. And you know, when the Carrie Reich asked him about, right, when Rockefeller was booed at the convention center, you know, he again just sort of laughed and was like, you know, he just sort of, you could see that he didn't really take these groups, these people seriously, and just assumed, I thought that, you know, as a member of the Republican Party, as his campaign manager, someone who's very important and sort of that conservative in the Republican Party, that he could control these people and that they could just count on their votes and they wouldn't actually change the party in the process. And I think having this collection, it really is unique that you get to see all of this literature and then be able to systematically show how, you know, there are these connections. And what's interesting about Rockefeller is that after 64, like after the end of, you know, Barry Goldwater's election, he just moves on to other issues. But these groups didn't just disappear or move on, and this is the way that we can continue. I mean, and I of course followed where Rockefeller was going and where he was, what he emphasized, but this, you know, I think if with this collection, and if more scholars do work in this collection, we will not, it almost will be impossible to be surprised by what we're living through today, you know, because we have all this material in one place. It's really amazing.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I started working on this project a really long time ago, before Donald Trump was on the national stage, so that gives you a sense of the slowness of my progress. But it was 2015, and I was at the Eagle Forum just following this lead from my grandparents' church, and I spoke with Ed Martin, who's now been appointed to the Trump administration, who's leading the Eagle Forum at that time. He had taken over executive directorship. And I told him I was interested in, foreign policy, and Phyllis Schlafly actually was far more influential probably in foreign policy even than she was with anti-feminism, and so that's why I was there, and I was interested in the materials there. And I came back the next summer, and she'd written her final book, which was called The Case for Trump. And I said to Mr. Martin, I don't understand, everything that I would think about Phyllis Schlafly and her, sort of her sensibilities and her approach and her interests and her deep, Catholic conservatism. I really don't understand how she could support this person. And he looked at me honestly like I was crazy and said, if you don't understand why Phyllis Schlafly supports Trump, I think there's a lot you need to learn. I think he thought I was a pretty terrible historian. And indeed, I think what it took was for me to take the knowledge that I was getting in these archives, to expand it out into ones like this one, the Hoag, but also there's ones at Kansas that are amazing too, and to really start to read it, to be able to recognize, like when you were talking about this recognition of here's the material that I recognize, right? To say, oh my goodness, here's the material I recognize that sort of fills out the story of a Phyllis Schlafly and the communities in which she was involved from the 50s through this moment, when I was there in 2016, that helps me really understand what that connection is. I think the other thing I would say about the value of an archive like this is that, we've really just only begun to mine it for what's in it. I think the initial first passes are fantastic, but if I just use an example from my own work, I found material that I never expected to find. So in going into the study of everyday right-wing people and foreign policy, I took my cues from the existing historiography, which suggested that I should be looking for anti-communism, defense hawkishness, and a little bit later, around the sort of 70s, 80s, a kind of neoconservative support for an ideal of nation building or something like that, which grows in the 1990s. So those were sort of where I lifted the radar and was looking. And honestly, for a couple of years, I just kept turning past the evidence that was right there in front of me about other things that were really important to them, because it just didn't match with what the historiography told me I should be seeing. So for example, I kept thinking, another thing about the Panama Canal? What's this? How come Rhodesia is such a cause celeb? What's with the obsession with, UNESCO taking over the schools? Why do they hate the World Court so much? What's with this, early opposition in, 63 to the possibility of changing the immigration laws? And I would turn it over and I would put it aside and I would say something like, whatever. And then I finally, had this moment. I guess this is more about confessing what a bad historian I am. But I finally sort of said, wait. Why do they, I see why they're talking about this. Please follow the evidence, Jennifer, right? Please follow the evidence. What they care about is internationalism. What they fear is the strictures of, international treaties, organizations, compacts that might limit the sovereignty of the United States. And that's when I looked back at all of those, Panama, Rhodesia, UN, UNESCO, all of it, World Court, and saw that the key word was actually sovereignty. They use it over and over again. It's like the number 1 to number 2 thing in the title of many of their organizations. When they list their agenda, national sovereignty is right there. And so there was kind of just hidden in plain sight, these things that I think many historians like me either sort of had their blinders on for, but they're gems. And there's so much more to discover, I think, that helps us understand, not only the past, but also the moment that we're in. And if I could just add one more thing quickly, because of interventions like John's, and pointing out to us that people on the far right are in fact actually in domestic politics anyway, the vanguard often of a conservative movement. I think I'm able to see the same thing and to use that insight, but to think about it in the foreign policy realm too, that these ideas about sovereignty and anti-internationalism are actually leading the way, and in some cases are more important than things like anti-communism or defense hawkishness or neoconservative nation building. So I think there's a richness in these collections that we've only scraped the surface of, and if we're open to really listening to what's there, coming up with some unexpected interpretations of what's actually happening on the right, in my case, in foreign policy in the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I wanted to do in my book was illustrate the networks that had, been shown between these two groups, this connectivity. And so there's all these different groups like the Birchers and so many other names that are all so interconnected, and archives like this really enable you to understand who's involved here. Because you can look at a pamphlet and see, okay, who's on the masthead? Okay, this guy's also the secretary of this organization. Okay, he's also involved in this one. So then all of a sudden you have this big network that stretches across the whole nation. And you can see all these guys are talking to each other. And what guys like Nelson Rockefeller were trying to do, and others, by calling them nuts, by calling them crackpots, they're trying to establish that distance, right? They're saying those guys are irresponsible and extremists, whereas we are the pragmatic, responsible Republicans and conservatives. But I'm gonna give an example that I think illustrates this idea of networking really well. So back in the 40s and 50s, there was a guy named Willis Stone. He's out of California. He ran a group called the Liberty Amendment Committee. And so you may be wondering, what's the Liberty Amendment? It was an amendment that he came up with that basically called for repealing the 16th Amendment. If you know your amendments, that's the one that is the income tax. So he wanted to get rid of the income tax, and then also he wanted the federal government out of the economy entirely, like everything, okay? And he came up with this amendment. He solidified it in 1954, and then he had this organization. They sent out magazines. He was kind of a financial failure. It didn't, some states passed it, but it didn't really end up going anywhere. But in 2010, Ron Paul, the very libertarian Republican from Texas, he's a congressman, put forth the exact Liberty Amendment as written by Willis Stone in 1954. So I called up Ron Paul. I'm not a personal friend of his. I just called his organization and asked, can I talk to Ron? And they were like, yeah. And so I talked to Ron Paul. This is the first oral interview I've ever done, ever. And so I'm talking to Ron Paul. I'm just scared out of my mind. It's the passing period. I was teaching high school at that time. And I asked him, I was like, why did you where did you find this? This is a thing that was written back in the 50s by a dude on the West Coast that and he was just like, I don't know. It just was something that came across my desk and I agreed with it. And to me, that shows the long arc of these organizations, that these ideas and these pamphlets that they put forth, they don't just die, they don't just wither, right? They persist. And so you got a guy who started something on the West Coast with no money in these magazines, and now it's being put forth by a congressman from Texas. And I really think that shows that these guys are the vanguard. They're the ones pushing, the envelope for conservatism.
I believe it was Ted Cruz who tweeted recently, defund the IRS,
right? And
which Willis Stone would have loved.
Doge, right?
Doge is right, absolutely in that spirit. Yeah, so I mean, for me, the significance, what I sort of see in this, it's a very Oregon-specific issue. So Oregon is proud of its moderate Republicans. Willamette alums like Mark Hatfield, who was a senator, moderate senator for many years, Bob Packwood, who is known for other things now properly, but who was known as a moderate. He was a very pro-choice Republican. Tom McCall, who was the Republican governor of Oregon, he called himself a progressive Republican, right? So this is who Oregon Republicans were supposed to be, right? Like Nelson Rockefeller. And so the idea that a guy who's a neo-Nazi with ties to right-wing domestic terrorists would become the chair of the Oregon Republican Party in 1978 is weird, right? How did that happen? And also, how did that get memory hold? Literally nobody knows this guy's name, right? This seems like an important moment in the history of the Oregon Republican Party, but it's completely memory hold. So, for me, that was, and when I find the guy I write about, Walter Huss, in the archive, I usually find him in boxes labeled crackpot letters, right? So Tom McCall has boxes of crackpot letters that are filled with the people who were part of Walter Huss's grassroots organization, right? Walter Huss traveled around the state every year, tens of thousands of miles, organizing people in American legions and local churches, et cetera, and so forth. And that is how he was able to take over temporarily the Oregon Republican Party. But when I was in his archive trying to figure out all these newsletters he's getting and all of these people he's corresponding with, I would Google, and it's nothing. Who are these people? No one has written about them. I don't know anything about them. But then when you go to the Hall Hoag collection, it's like, oh, there they are, right? And so what it makes visible is that from the perspective of someone like Tom McCall or Mark Hatfield, when they saw Walter Huss, they saw a nut. They saw a crackpot. They saw an individual who just like made no sense. Where does this person come from? And he didn't come out of nowhere, right? It was this movement that was really dispersed nationwide, often international, right? But which mainstream conservatives or Republicans just did not want to think about, right, or engage or know about in a bunch of ways. And what it was that made them illegible to someone like Mark Hatfield is that were 4 features of who these folks were. And this is what the stuff in the Hall Hoag is all about. They didn't believe in multiracial democracy. They didn't believe in religious pluralism. They didn't believe in internationalism, so they were opposed to the United Nations, and they were obsessed with conspiracy theories. There wasn't a conspiracy theory that they met that they didn't agree with, right? And I should also add that a lot of those conspiracy theories revolved around science, right, and health, right? The idea, people controlling the weather, them controlling the weather, there's like tons of that stuff in the 1970s, right? Walter Huss believed that Jews controlled the weather in the 1970s, right? So the Jewish space laser thing has very deep roots. So the Hall Hoag, but we wouldn't know that, right? If we didn't have access to this kind of substrate. I think of it as a kind of a rhizomatic political culture that's kind of under the surface of American political culture, that kind of runs under the surface and occasionally kind of pops up in the form of a guy like Walter Huss, who wins an election to become the chair of the Oregon Republican Party. And the response of people who don't know about that underlying network of people is like, well, that's weird. And then it goes away, and then, oh, okay, well, we're done now, right? Like after 1964, oh, okay, well, that's over, so we don't have to worry about it. And so the Hall Hoag collection, to me, is like this kind of vision into this really potent kind of world, often invisible to folks in the media and politics, but which ultimately had a profound impact, right, on our political culture. Okay, last question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience, and that is, what does this collection and the kinds of studies that have come out of collections like this tell us about the history and present of democracy in the United States? Just a small question.
Right. Exactly. Well, and in thinking about this question and preparing for today, I was also looking at some of the journal articles written about, newspaper articles written about Gordon Hall, and I remember seeing how he was talking about how fragile, right, democracy is. He was this like in the early 1960s, and he's writing about this, and but he also had this. He also had this. What at least the sense that I was getting from what I was reading, right? He's like I thought it was interesting how he defined, an ultra-rightist or someone who's on the far left or the far right as someone who no longer believes in institutions, and that our democracy and democratic practices can bring, that can be a venue for you to achieve your goals. Well, it was really interesting. And it just sort of, when I was thinking about this collection, one, right, how fragile our democracy is, but also that we can't just sort of set our institutions on just I'm gonna say set it and forget it, because there's all of these groups who are working very, very hard. They are producing so much literature, and we can see, right, that they're making these connections and do have an influence on politicians and establishment figures, but also, part of if you consider this their power is that it might seem fringe on some level, but they also are saying things that, connect to, a lot of Americans connect to what they say. And I think part of why, when I looked at material, people attacking Nelson Rockefeller, I could understand, I wasn't surprised by, the racial piece, is that, because, in my own research and in my own life, honestly, you can certainly see examples where people don't necessarily, are extreme racists, but they can find some connection and value and appeal in some of these extreme ideas. And, it just, and I think, and I didn't realize at the time that was true for the conspiracy theories as well, and right, this opposition to internationalism. And so I think that, sort of moving forward, like it just sort of reminds me that, you know, not only do we need to pay more attention to these groups, right, and sort of their critiques, but how it resonates with people beyond their circles. And maybe that will help us to, you know, understand, you know, how to bolster our institutions, but also to try to understand people from different backgrounds and viewpoints, and sort of, I think it helps us to make sense of like a lot of what we're hearing today in our politics. So it's a little bit of a all over the place with my answer. It was a big question, but there's some of the ideas that I've been thinking about, you know, in preparing for today.
I think just thinking about the people who I'm looking at, which is, you know, and taking the theme that they care about, right? So looking at those who are organizing mostly around the threat of what they perceive as a world government. With that focus and with a long timeline, I think a number of things have become clear thinking about this democracy question. I mean, I think one is that clearly we need to identify democracy as like a prescriptive and aspirational category, and actually not, I mean, it's valued by some people and not valued at all by others, and that's been true in the past, and it's true today. It's not a timeless, prescribed form of government at all. It's it's contingent. None of the people who I study understood themselves as defenders of democracy. You know, quite the opposite. They were nationalists who defended with a constitutional republic, really from the depredations that might come from like subversive influences from outside, mostly, again, internationalist ideas and organizations that they saw as stealing not only the sovereignty of the nation, really, but, you know, the sovereignty, really, of the 48, or depending when we're looking at, 48 or 50 states, and even their own personal sovereignty, their ability to govern themselves as sovereign selves, right? They found the ideas of, like, the equal representation of nations that you might see in the League of Nations or the UN, human rights, the idea that there's an international standard of justice, like all of these things very threatening. So they were illiberal and undemocratic. And I think recovering their history in collections like the one here, like just helps us understand more of what that illiberal vision of the United States looks like, and how it was sustained. And I guess to build on a point that you were making, Marsha, I mean, so if John's work, which you all need to, you know, and everyone needs to go read the books now, but the work of thinking about the far right as a vanguard, I've found it very provocative in my own work, as I said, but I've actually also taken it further, and I've started to think that some of the best guides to thinking about what we see in a collection like Hal Hoeg are actually scholars like, I'm getting into the weeds here, sorry, but like Michael Rogan, who actually wrote in the 80s, he's a political scientist, who basically looked at Reagan when Reagan was called an extremist, and the right when it was called extremist at that point in time, and said that actually, you know, it's pretty American, is what I see. It's deeply connected to very mainstream, common symbols, fears, fantasies. He did a lot of cultural work in American life. And I often think, you know, I don't know how many people are familiar with like the classic work of John Hyam, Strangers in the Land from the 50s, where he's laying out these, you know, strands of kind of anti-modernism and nativism. These were widely held beliefs. They're very American. They're very mainstream. So it's not really that the stuff in Hal Hoeg should make us only think of margins and extremes. It should make us think about the ways that margins and extremes draw, I think, from, you know, the very core of, you know, many of the cultural, ideological, and political experiences that we might have as a nation. So for me, it sort of, it magnifies the importance of what's in the collection to see it in that broad context.
Yes, goodness, it's a big question, the question of democracy. Before the panel we were talking, and the way that I want to address this is that you guys may know who David Frum is. David Frum was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, and he's also now currently a writer for The Atlantic. And back during Trump's administration, I think it was like 2018 or so, he wrote a piece where he said, a quote, he said, "If conservatives become convinced that they can't win democratically, they will not abandon conservatism, they will abandon democracy." And I read that quote at first, and I was like, wow, that's really profound. And then I started thinking about it, and I'm not really sure the conservative movement has ever been democratic, and I'm not really sure that they're ever really that conservative, because if you think of conservatism as a word, the essence is to conserve what currently exists. What the conservative movement is actually doing is reacting. It's a reactionary movement seeking to repeal, to wrench American society back to some former era. And you can look at this by the organizations. The Claremont Institute, for example, which is an organization out of California, that says that the US went wrong during the progressive era. They basically were like, Abe Lincoln was the last great president, and ever since then we've been on the wrong track. Other guys might look at the existence of multiracial democracy as the problem, right? And this is in writings as well. And so when I say that, we look at when I say they're not democratic, we can look at the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, the allegations of voter fraud, which are really not true, but are intended to put forth the idea that democracy is untrustworthy. The desire to limit the number of voters and who can vote, right? Like, for example, I live in Harris County, which is in Texas, and there was an attempt by the state to put one ballot box in Harris County. We have 6 million people that live in Harris County. And so they're straight up attempting to try to stifle the votes of urban areas in favor of areas that vote Republican, right? And so when you're trying to do these things, at a certain point, you just have to say, like, you guys don't believe in democracy, right? Like, this is not a democratic movement. And so that's kind of where I come down on it, is that this is just, as you said, it is an illiberal movement, an undemocratic movement, and one that is trying to push America. Basically, William Buckley said it very well in the very first edition of National Review. He said that the conservative movement is standing athwart history, yelling stop, And we are trying to actively push the other way. Like, that's what conservatism is about.
And he said that in 1955, right after a Supreme Court decision that we might all remember from 1954.
That's right.
Brown v. Board, right? Not coincidentally. Yeah. So for me, I have to have a little Brown moment. Sorry, since I'm here and I'm an alum and I was marketed that way. So, so I was in college at Brown in the late '80s, right around when history ended. If you all remember that, that was great. 1989, after the Berlin Wall fell, right, and then it was all good. We were all democratic from now on. We won. That's going great. And so, anyway, so I was taking a course with Jim Patterson, a modern U.S. history course, and we were assigned a book by Alan Brinkley, Voices of Protest, I believe it's called. And in that book, I encountered for the first time in my life figures like Charles Coughlin, Father Coughlin, and Gerald L.K. Smith. I distinctly remember learning about these figures. And Gerald L.K. Smith was a guy who founded something called the America First Party, as well as the Christian Nationalist Crusade. In the 1940s, might be familiar. Anyway, Gerald L.K. Smith was also a massive anti-Semite and basically a fascist. So I remember reading about Gerald L.K. Smith in this book in 1989 and thinking, like, goodness, what a kook, what a crackpot. Thank God that's over, right? Thank God we don't talk about America First and Christian nationalism anymore in 1989. And so I think for me, that was an expression of my own kind of socialization into a kind of world. And I so appreciate what Gordon Hall did, but also to be slightly critical of his view of the world, right? The idea, there's a center that is democratic, and then there are these other places that are kind of fringes and extreme that are anti-democratic. And so I had sort of been incorporated into that. And so I think when we recognize the depth and extent, like you were saying, Jennifer, of this anti-democratic tradition in the US, not as some fringy thing, but as very much in the water, right? And how does it get into the water? It often gets into the water through the activism of not necessarily super powerful and wealthy people, right? Like a lot of the folks who I study were not wealthy, were not well off, were not well connected. They just had sweat equity, right? And they were really committed to a vision of the United States that was a Christian nation, the United States that was of a nation that belongs to white people, and of a nation that was sovereign and separate from the rest of the world. And that was their vision, right, of what America should be. And when Walter Huss took over the chair of the Oregon Republican Party, Gerald Ford called his friend, Wendell Wyatt, who had been a moderate Republican congressman, and he said, "Have you guys gotten rid of that nut yet?" Right, so Gerald Ford's perception of the takeover of the party by this person who'd been working for like 20 years to do it was like, "Have you guys gotten rid of that nut yet?" He couldn't sort of see what was beneath this movement that was percolating inside his party and had been there for decades and would continue to be there. And so where do we look to find that? And how do we tell the history of that? And there's really no better place right now than like the Hoag collection, which has a lot of this nutty stuff that turns out to have had far more sort of historical legs, right, and import than people would have thought back in 1989, like myself, when history was on the verge of ending. So, all right, so with that, we have time for questions. We have, about 25 minutes or so for questions. So I will stand up and field questions from the audience. And I don't know, do we have there's a microphone over there. So don't be shy. I mean, we can just like go on and on. Get a bunch of historians in a room and there's no problem having us yammer on. Excellent.
Hi, how you doing? I'm Tom. I have a question, because you mentioned Rush Limbaugh kind of watering down his beliefs publicly, that type of thing. I think there's a lot of modern arguments that have a lot of roots in past more extreme arguments, and they've found ways to make them less obvious. Alex Jones talking about globalists using very similar theories, as like the protocols and of that type of conspiracism. Robert Welch not using anti-Semitic language, but harboring people like Revelo P. Oliver. George Lincoln Rockwell, I think he ran for governor, and he didn't use swastikas at all. He kind of switched his arguments from Jewish people to black people because it was a little more popular. How do we connect those dots for people so they can dig into that a little further and understand why, like Tucker Carlson on Fox News talking about the great replacement theory in ways that aren't explicit, but come out of, the far-right ecosystem like David Lane from The Order, who came up with white genocide theory. And that's where all that comes from. How do we connect those dots for people so they don't fall for this?
How do we fix people's brains, Seth?
So there is the kind of genetic fallacy, right? The idea that like, here's something that someone is saying, and if I can trace it back to Hitler, there you go. Therefore, what you just said must be wrong, right? Which is not a very convincing argument to people, right? Hitler was a vegetarian. Therefore, if you're a vegetarian, you're a Nazi, right? So I'm not saying that that's what you're saying, right? But oftentimes that is the way people will combat an argument like that. Well, just because George Lincoln Rockwell said that this is just my opinions about immigration, and I have other reasons for it. I don't know anything about George Lincoln Rockwell. That's not why I believe this, right? I just happen to believe. So in some ways, it's hard. As historians, we're just interested in reconstructing these genealogies and trying to figure out how do certain ideas move through a culture and find purchase and so on. That's part of what we do. So we just find it valuable in and of itself. But in terms of then communicating that knowledge to a general public that is interested in it, not because they care about history, but for political reasons, it's an incredibly challenging thing. And I don't have any great answers as to how that's done, right? And I don't know if that's necessarily even our job as historians, though obviously we do have a responsibility to the public, right, to inform people. But it's very easy for people who don't want to hear it to just tune it out, right?
And part of the issue is I think people have to care as well, like the American public, because we have Lee Atwater on tape talking about how they took super racist things that people were saying in the South and then converted them into much more political savvy language. And if you point that out to people and you're like, well, this, the tax cuts or whatever have roots in this super racist stuff, people are like, yeah, well, but I believe in cutting taxes. And so it's like, well, if you agree with the conservative mission, like no matter what the roots draw back to, people may not care, unfortunately.
I think one way to think about it might be that finding the origins of something doesn't solve the problem that neither the original person who was thinking about and writing about these things, nor the person who invokes it later is dealing with, right? So I think that the way I think about it, and I can just give you an example from my own work, is that it's almost like there's a series of problematics that emerge around particular issues at particular times. So I'm just going to give the sovereignty example. So if you go back to 1919, it's a very difficult time in the world, right? It's like the war has just stopped what has been the high point of globalization in the world. Empires are dying. Some states are dying and new ones are being formed. And right at this moment, they come up with this idea that we're going to have a world government called the League of Nations. And it produces, great joy and cheer among some people who are internationalists. And it produces enormous fear and anxiety among other people. And their anxiety is really about what does it mean to be a sovereign nation in the world, and how am I going to be governed, and what is it going to mean for me? And I think of that as a problematic that gets worked out, and the ideas that sort of come out of the left about internationalism sort of take their own forms and have their own symbols and their own fantasies, and we might think of Black internationalism, sort of working off that moment. And then people on the right work off that moment too, but there are recurring times when these problems, so again, just talking about my own subject matter, of sovereignty, nationhood, power, self-governance, when these recur again. And when they recur, they often draw on or echo some of the same symbology or fantasy or whatever we want to call it. And so that there's no disabusing this person who is re-echoing it or reusing it, because they're facing in their own mind, I think, kind of the same problem. So I think today, part, for example, of what we're seeing with the recurrence of a lot of this is another crisis, I think there's a crisis in the international order. I don't think the US is alone, right? The US is among many nations who are experiencing a rise of a right. I think these are crises of sovereignty in the face of the EU, NATO, the WTO, these things that have been sort of growing in power, and with the end of history and the end of the Soviet Union have become really the only game in town was internationalism, right? And so these are I feel like these are crisis reactions, and they pick up what they can from pieces of the past that have been circulating. They circulate in this world that Hall and Hoag revealed to us. They circulate for a really long time. And they use them again. But the idea that you can sort of draw the connection and then disabuse people, I think, presupposes that they don't have real investments in it now, and in thinking that it might be true for them now, if that makes sense. That's how I've been thinking about it, because this occurs to me too all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say too that I'm not really sure who's reading the work of historians these days. We write editorials, and hope that someone's going to notice it in the newspaper, and if they weren't going to pick up the book. But I was just sort of thinking maybe something that for those, I was sort of thinking, rather than thinking about the people who subscribe to these ideas, but instead thinking about for politicians, for example, who are invested in multiracial democracy or our institutions, if we can get enough information out about sort of this illiberal history we've been talking about, that they'll stop using phrases like "this is not who we are," you know, and stop acting as if like, the extremism or sort of like our politics, like people in our sort of like political rhetoric sort of rejecting, sort of democratic ideals and, not saying that like, I have no idea where this came from, but actually take this seriously and try to look a little bit deeper, so that maybe those of us who do care, right, will, stop acting surprised over and over again about what we're seeing. I mean, that's the best I can offer at this moment. Thank you for the question.
Jen, are we getting questions from the online audience, or are they not able to? They can. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think one of that first question there identified, I think actually one of the issues with academia is that there's very little crosstalk between history, for example, and anthropology or psychology or neuroscience. I'm a psychologist, neuroscientist, and we study how the structures of the mind give rise to these, moments of cognitive dissonance and many other features that bleed into this, but the history around it that scaffolds those very moments at the individual level that give rise to these emergent properties like extremism actually don't have a strong hold in the tradition of academia. It's not well studied, which is a problem.
Anyone have thoughts about that? Yeah, I mean, what I would say that one thing I've discovered is historians had not been very good about writing about the people in the Hall Hoag collection. There's just not a lot of literature to draw on of any form, but the place where it has existed were actually left-wing activists who were cataloging it and paying attention to it in a different way than Gordon Hall was, right? In a different spirit. And so these were folks, I mean, the Anti-Defamation League used to be one of those organizations that did a lot of that work, not so much anymore, but back in the day they did. And various other groups. There was a man named Wesley McCune who ran a thing called Group Research Incorporated. There are 512 boxes of their archive at Columbia, which almost no one has used. And he basically created these enormous maps, and he just collected all this data on the far right, and he offered it up to the Democratic Party to use, and they were like, what? We don't need that, thanks. But he would shop it out to journalists occasionally who would use it. So this isn't exactly about the academy and disciplinariness, but it's about just our institutions who study politics kind of failed, right, to perceive what was going on. And the people who did perceive what was going on were often dismissed as being partisan and political, right? You're just doing this because you want to be mean to the Republican Party, right? That's the only reason why you're tracing these connections between Barry Goldwater and a whole bunch of kind of quasi-fascist organizations. You just want to tag Barry Goldwater with a fascist label so that you can undermine him and call him an extremist, when that's not really who Barry Goldwater is, right? And the people doing this, I think they did want to defeat Barry Goldwater, but they also were very interested in just figuring out, where's the money coming from? Who's providing the money? Who's publishing these pamphlets? What other organizations are these groups connected to? And when you started scratching the surface, it got really dark really quickly, right? And so, again, sorry to come back to the guy I'm studying, but no one ever called him an anti-Semite, and there are thousands of newspaper articles about him. The guy had 2 folders labeled Jews. He was a gut bucket anti-Semite his entire life. It was the structuring, organizing, anti-Semitism was the structuring principle of his life. And you never would have known it if you read the thousands of newspaper articles about him. And I only know it because he foolishly left behind 57 boxes of his papers at the University of Oregon. For me, I'm Jewish, I found them, right? And so there you go, right? I've been able to reconstruct this history of this guy, but it was just kind of just illegible to his contemporaries. And so I think that's a question, academics are very recursive anyway, but just asking this question of why haven't we seen this, and how can we collaborate
and see different parts of the elephant, right? And different disciplinary approaches have different strengths, right, in making sense of that. So that would be my...
Yeah, and certainly I think if you that we could do a better job as historians working with sociologists, political scientists, and other groups that could help us understand our own subjects better. But I think that this still, I think, doesn't necessarily puncture the ivory tower that we write from. A lot of history books don't end up on bestseller lists, right? People just don't read the work all the time, unfortunately. Sometimes because our prose can be a little, sometimes not quite as snappy perhaps as people want. Sometimes it's the price of books can be high if you publish with the university press. So there's a lot of countervailing things that might prevent people from reading history, but the fact is a lot of people just don't read history much anymore. History written by historians. I'm not talking about like Bill O'Reilly, like killing whoever these days, right? I'm talking about historians writing history. And another problem that I think, even if we work together as an academic community, another problem is that, we could all get together and post on Twitter about it and like no one would ever read it because Elon Musk would censor it, right? Like, we don't control the social media companies. Those are controlled by billionaires who all, by the way, sat in the front row of Donald Trump's inauguration. And so to me, like the issue confronting us is not just one of who do we collaborate with academically to get our message out there and to be as accurate as possible, but even just getting our message out there is tough. One time after Trump's election in 2016, I reached out to the Boston Globe to pitch a piece, and they basically were like, "Yeah, we're not interested in looking backwards anymore. Like, we don't want to hear about any like historical connections between like Trump and the conservative movement." And I was like, "Okay, like what do you want? All right, like what do you want me to say to something like that? If even mainstream publications won't publish the things that we have to say, it's hard, especially because most of them don't pay you any money, like, and that's also a thing."
But I would add to maybe something that we should also consider is that we're thinking about how we get the word out. That we have this collection that is digitized, and everyone needs to be teaching these materials, right? We need to be showing the primary sources to our students and as many people as possible, because there's certainly a lot of people in the United States and around the world who, don't really want to hear what academics have to say anymore. So maybe just send them to the sources, and this is such a valuable resource that maybe, we should take a little bit of hope in that this material is now accessible to more people.
Right. Though there's one horrible caveat that I would add to that, which is part of the reason why I left Twitter is that I did a thread about Gerald L.K. Smith, and some Nazis picked it up and promoted it and took a meaning from it that was the opposite of what my meaning was in trying to talk about it. But they were like, "Hey, this Gerald L.K. Smith guy sounds pretty cool. We should learn more about him." Right? So, I mean, it is, and I know the folks who did the collection are kind of mindful of this, right? But like, these are really horrible, violent sort of ideas, a lot of these things, and we can't control what people make of them, right? And unfortunately, there are people who are going to read them and be like, "That sounds good," right? Here's my history that I am trying to carry forward, and that's terrifying. And that's something that I, in my 1989 incarnation of myself, would have not imagined, and I still had that naivete in 2021 or 2022. It did not occur to me. I did not do a thread about Gerald L.K. Smith because I wanted people to learn about him and emulate what he thought. I did it because I wanted to draw that parallel and draw those connections. But I didn't have, once I put it out into the world, I did not have control over it, right? And that's, that was a really, to me, a very disturbing moment. And my attempts to kind of do this publicly and end up serving an end that was absolutely the opposite of what I wanted to serve. Yeah.
We have time for one more.
Sure.
So I'm asking this question as a curator. If you were going to embark on a Hull Hoag-like project in the 2020s, in our current moment, what might you want to highlight? What is our responsibility in these kinds of institutions to preserve, especially when some of this information is now being suppressed?
So as in, like, what should you be collecting?
That's hard because so much of it is ephemeral, right? I mean, like, just print every tweet that Elon Musk tweets, like.
I mean, that's real. Like, we've been wondering what to do about email and still don't know what to do about it. And we've had email for a really long time, right? So social media just sort of compounds that, and the questions about what happened with the Internet Archive, right, for example, which so many of us used and now don't have access to. Yeah, but I guess you could also, your question might be about subject matter, not just form, right? Yeah.
Certainly anything I think related to DEI stuff, the CRT stuff, Christopher Rufo, any of that stuff. I mean, they're very public with what they're trying to do. That's the thing is like the conservative movement in the past decade has become very emboldened. You know, they publish their stuff online. You know, the Claremont Institute has a whole online arm very clearly detailing what they're trying to do. Project 2025, you know, is a document that is just available for people to read. I don't think they'll ever delete that stuff, but you know, it is possible, I suppose.
I mean, so much of what I've used involves correspondence that people thought was private, right? And so the whole HOEG is all public, right, stuff. So like, for example, the guy I study was super paranoid, and so he recorded a lot of his phone calls, which is amazing for me as a historian, right? To have just the actual phone calls that he made between his fellow activists. So what is the equivalent of that today, right? Twitter DMs? Right, Telegram. Right. But how does one get access to that? How does one archive that? And so in some ways it's like, you know, what used to be done through letters or other things are now done in ways that are perhaps not even able to be cataloged, right?
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I think also the question, Joe, that you raised at the beginning when you noted that it's hard to get the sort of official collections of the right into what we would think of as a publicly accessible archival institutions. And I think that's real. And I don't know well enough really what's happening today to think that it's even possible, whether you could convince anyone to sort of, or any group to deposit their material. I think there's such a long-term leeriness about it, but what I see with, you know, privatization in general, with, you know, the wealthy and those on the right suggests that it could become even more difficult actually to access over time. I mean, many of the archives that we've worked in have been proprietary, and you know, in part, they can say no when you arrive, and you can Google any of us and find out immediately. Like, not only am I not conservative, I'm like a leftist feminist, you know. So like, it can't be hidden. But it could be that the access could become more difficult over time. I really don't know. It's a good question.
Well, this is part of the curatorial art, and Heather and her colleagues are extremely good at this, is, you know, getting people to give us stuff. But it is a very material question for us, because having this amazing resource in Hall HOAG, you know, how do we continue that? Because obviously the questions continue, the continuities, and it's not all about tracing genealogies. You know, this is really central, as you've all been describing, to the story of this country and much else. So I think that's really quite significant. So we are eager to hear on an ongoing basis from all of you and any other scholars with recommendations for things that can continue. And, you know, what is the Hall HOAG of today? And that's, I think, what we need to be committed to building going forward, because we're already here.
I mean, one of the things that just to talk about your question just a smidge further, is that historians aren't really in the business of necessarily doing the collecting. You know, we kind of sift through collections that have already been created, but I do know that there are a lot of journalists who have infiltrated, you know, discords and gabs and all that kind of stuff, and are very much involved in kind of documenting the modern day far right. You know, and so they may actually be a really good resource to talk to and see, because I'm pretty tech savvy, but I don't know if you can download a whole Discord server if you're not an admin. But if you can, that would be pretty cool, because then you could get to see like what these guys are saying in their online chat rooms.
So I think, regrettably, we're at time, and this has been great. I feel like we could keep going, but in fact, we can keep going, because for those who can stay, there will be some materials. I don't know what your schedules call you to do next, but there are students who have been involved in working with the collection, and so I think we can continue a sort of lively conversation informally here, and if you want to look at the exhibition downstairs as you're heading toward the door. But I think this has been tremendous. It is such a wonderful launch for this digitization effort, but really what's important about that are all the reasons that you have flagged. So thank you so much for your thoughts and your attention to this. And I know this is going to continue to grow, and it's only going to grow in importance, it seems. So thank you again. Can we have a hand for our panel?